Hi, my name is Markeisha Johnson, and I am conducting my presentation on family therapy with clients dealing with grief and loss. The reason I chose this topic is because of my own personal experience with grief and loss. I recently lost my father in July of 2018, and I am still going through the grief and loss process. And I know that it's important for clinicians to recognize their countertransference. So if I have a client that is dealing with similar experiences, then I would know how to conduct myself and help them through their process without getting too triggered by my own grief. What is grief? In the family systems definition, grief is viewed as a multidimensional process of reconceptualization of reality, focusing on regaining stability and meaning after a loss, with family members using their ongoing relationship with each other to engage in that process. And this is quoted from Gilbert. And grief can be a dynamic of things. It can be the loss of a loved one, it can be the loss of a house, the loss of a job, a pet. It doesn't necessarily have to be a death. But for the purposes of this particular presentation, we will be focusing more so on grief as it relates to death of a loved one. There are different types of grief, but for this presentation, I'm going to focus on four. Complicated grief, acute grief, integrated grief, and delayed grief. Complicated grief is a condition that occurs when something impedes the process of adapting to a loss. The symptoms of complicated grief is intense and prolonged yearning, longing and sorrow, frequent insistent thoughts of the deceased, and difficulty accepting the painful reality of the death. Complicated grief can be classified as a mental health disorder, and individuals who experience complicated grief, their symptoms are pretty much severe. They tend to have feelings of guilt that is related to the death of the deceased, self-criticism, which is only related to the loss, and sometimes they have suicidal thoughts of not wanting to live without the deceased or a wish to rejoin the deceased. Oftentimes, many people who experience complicated grief have avoidance of situations and people that reminds them of their loss. So those are just several other different symptoms of complicated grief. Acute grief is the initial response, often intense and highly emotional, dominating our mind and oftentimes can be disruptive. A definite syndrome characterized by psychological and somatic symptoms includes sensation of somatic distress that occur in waves lasting 20 minutes to an hour, images of the deceased in dreams, feelings of guilt, disorientation behavior such as restlessness, insomnia, inability to concentrate, and inability to complete daily tasks. An initial period of acute grief evolves naturally into integrated grief. Integrated grief is the permanent response after adaptation to the loss in which satisfaction in ongoing life is renewed. When individuals are in this stage of grief, they are coming to terms with the fact that their loved one is no longer here, and it's more of a positive stage. Their thoughts or memories of the deceased are no longer as preoccupying or disabling. The individuals find a way of staying connected to the deceased without them being physically present. There also may be times when acute grief reemerges. However, this is typically around the holidays or after another loss. For example, my dad died in July. However, when his birthday came along in October, it brought up those memories. So I went back to that stage of acute grief. And also now Father's Day is coming around the corner, and I'm pretty sure that I may go back to that stage of acute grief. However, it will only last for probably or just around that time. And then I'll go back to probably integrated grief because I understand that he's no longer here. Another form of grief is delayed grief. Delayed grief is grief that is postponed and resurfaces at a later time. Oftentimes, people who are in the stage of delayed grief typically suppress or ignore grief, and this, however, will most likely affect other parts of their well-being. Here's another example for you guys. So after my father passed away, I immediately went to seek counseling. There was no way that I could handle a loss that great while I was attended school, while I had to work, while I had to take care of my daughter. I had to check it. So I found a therapist and we talked about grief and loss. At that time, she praised me for coming so quickly because she said she had a client who waited 20 years to grieve after the loss of his child. And oftentimes, people that are in the stage of delayed grief, life still has to go on. So they put their own grief, personal grief, on the back burner while they either make funeral arrangements, take care of possessions and belongings of the deceased, or they just have to be strong for others. They are either the father or maybe the wife passed away and they have to stay strong for the kids or vice versa. So there are reasons why people postpone their grief. However, just because you postpone it does not mean that you're not going to grieve. It may happen 10 years from now, it may happen 10 days from now, but it's going to happen. Bereavement. Bereavement is a specific type of grief related to someone dying. So I know I spoke in the earlier slides that grief can either be the loss of a loved one or the loss of a job, of her house. But the difference between grief and bereavement is actually related to someone who has passed away and died. About 7% of bereaved older adults, however, will develop the mental health condition of complicated grief. Older adults experience bereavement at a much higher rate than their younger adults. Research suggests that over 70% of older adults experience bereavement in a 2.5-year period. There are 4 different components of grief. The first component is separation distress. Separation distress, usually our individuals who experience this have symptoms of sadness, anxiety, pain, helplessness, anger, shame, yearning, and loneliness. Then we have traumatic distress. Traumatic distress is when you're in a state of disbelief and shock. For me, I experienced this component of grief when my father passed away because it was unexpected. We had no clue that this would have occurred as soon as it did. So I was more so in a stage of shock, disbelief, like I couldn't understand what was happening. Then you have the stage or component of grief where you feel guilty. You maybe think like, oh, it's something that I could have done to prevent my loved one from passing away. Or you may have feelings of remorse and regret. Maybe you and the loved one wasn't on good terms at the time of his demise. Like maybe you haven't spoken to that person in a long time and you didn't get a chance to apologize, or you guys didn't get a chance to hash out everything. So those are different components of grief. Then you have social withdrawal, and that's kind of self-explanatory. A person who's experiencing social withdrawal isolate themselves from social settings. They don't want to be bothered. Like they want to just be left alone. And all of those are just different components, and people are at different stages of experiencing grief. So we talked about the different types of grief. We defined what grief is, and we talked about the different components and different stages of grief. Now we're going to move forward to treatment. Family-focused grief therapy. And this is more so aimed to focus on family grief therapy, which is to reduce the morbid effects of grief amongst families at risk of poor psychosocial outcome. Family-focused grief therapy is brief, focused, and time-limited. It's an intervention that typically comprises of 4 to 8 sessions of 90-minute intervals for 9 to 18 months. And that just varies depending on the level of treatment that family is currently in, if they've completed goals or not. So it can range from 9 to 18 months. Family-focused grief therapy aims to prevent the complications of bereavement by enhancing the functioning of the family through explanation of its cohesion, communicating of thoughts and feelings, and handling of conflict. So there are 3 phases of family-focused grief therapy. Phase 1 is the assessment phase, and that is typically between 1 to 2 weekly sessions. And it concentrates on identifying issues and concerns that are relevant to the specific family on devising a plan to deal with. Then we have phase 2, which is the intervention phase, and that is typically 2 to 4 sessions which focuses on the agreed concerns. Then we have phase 3, which is the termination phase, and that is 1 to 2 sessions, which consolidates gains and confronts the end of therapy. So frequency of the number of sessions in each phase are modified to meet the needs of each family. Each family is different. Each family may enter the phase at different intervals. So you just basically have to assess the family, and it's a family case-by-case basis. Another form of treatment is for individuals that are experiencing complicated grief. And there is complicated grief treatment. The central premise of complicated grief treatment is that bereavement is a universal life event and that grief and adaptation to loss are natural inborn responses. Complicated grief can be reliably detected with standardized measures such as the Inventory of Complicated Grief. And you will use this measure to assess the level of grief that that individual is experiencing to see if they meet the standards. CGT is a structured intervention that is typically administered in 16 weekly sessions organized in 4 phases. So we have phase 1, which is getting started, phase 2, core revisiting sequence, phase 3, mid-course review, and phase 4, the closing sequence. There are 7 core components of complicated grief treatment. 1, sharing information. 2, promoting self-observation. 3, rebuilding connection. 4, advancing aspirational goals and rewarding activities. 5, revisiting the story of the death. 6, revisiting a world changed by loss. And 7, fostering continuing bonds through living memories. Well, this concludes my presentation. Here is a list of references that I use to back up some facts as it relates to therapy and the treatment that is used for individuals and families who are experiencing grief and loss. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation. I know that this presentation definitely helped me with my own personal process, grief and loss process, and also helped me to do some self-reflection so that if I am treating or meeting with clients who have experienced the same type of loss that I've experienced, I will understand and recognize my countertransference so that their experiences, I'm not easily triggered by their experiences, and I'm able to effectively help them go through their own grief and loss process effectively. So thank you guys for listening. Please comment. I would love to engage in discussion regarding this presentation, and you guys have a great night. Thank you.